focusing on managing migratory flows. Our presidency for this semester, which is been collaborating with the Italian presidency, has put this as one of our priorities on the agenda. Europe needs to show that it is able to effectively deal with these issues. I'd like to remind you that at the European Council in October, we held our first in-depth discussion on this point, and this, of course, while we were dealing with the drama that was unfolding on Lampedusa. And at the Council in December, we heard what the Task Force on the Mediterranean had to say, what its conclusions were. On the 24th and 25th of January in Athens, we held the informal GHA Council. Commissioner Malmström was there, and there we did a first stock-taking of the situation, having heard the conclusions of the Task Force for the Mediterranean. So we do have a base on which we could place our guidelines for the post-Stockholm period. Of course, we are expecting the communication by the Commission in March, so at the latest, by June, we need to adopt the strategic guidelines on this issue. Now, the way we deal with the problem in Bulgaria, Italy, Malta, Greece, on a day-to-day level, can't wait for March and can't wait for June. This is a problem that we have to face every single day, and sometimes the pressure is dramatic. What we've understood from what people have been saying here today is that things need to be done. The Commission has offered an answer, and I would like to tell you that I will be representing your views at Council, because I've heard your anxiety, and it's not just Bulgarian citizens who feel that there is a problem. I think that the whole of the European Council Parliament knows there's a problem, because it has to do with our consciousness as Europeans.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all the speakers. That debate is closed, and we now move to the debate on the situation in Egypt. And the first speaker for the Vice President of the Commission High Representative is Mr. Venizelos, when he's ready.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament, 3 years ago, Egyptian citizens from all layers of society rebelled against an oppressive regime. They asked for freedom, human dignity, social justice, and better living conditions. Throughout this period, Europe has stood by the Egyptian people to support the contribution of all political forces to the political life and democratic transition in the country. We stand by that, and we stand by the European people. Many have lost their lives in this battle for a democratic society and a better future for them and for their children, for their families. Many have been injured. Many have faced the consequences of what's happening every day. So we feel very concerned about violence, the loss of human life, during and before and after the constitutional referendum, and on the anniversary of the Arab Revolution. Baroness Ashton did condemn unequivocally all violent acts, the disproportionate use of violence, and non-democratic attacks. The ratification of the new constitution via the referendum on the 14th and 15th of January obviously is a very positive development, and we hope that it will allow for the full and speedy implementation of the roadmap for the transition to democracy, which is followed by the Egyptian government. This will allow them to overcome their problems, because in preparing the constitutions, problems there were. It's very important to be able to guarantee the fundamental freedoms, and in particular the freedom to demonstrate and also of political speech and expression. The European message is crystal clear. If there is no full respect of human rights, the roadmap cannot lead to a safe place. The new constitutional roadmap is obviously an improvement, especially the chapter on human rights, which includes the freedom of expression, of demonstration and women's rights. The full harmonization of all and future legislation with international standards and with the Constitution, and in particular with international rules protecting human rights, is of critical importance. The Constitution must be implemented in a way which guarantees full control of all levels of government and state action and protect people from political intervention in their lives. And of course it should be normal courts that try people for their everyday actions. We are not able to know if there were irregularities or not when the referendum was run. It seems that the end result has not suffered from any negative implications. So we welcome the result of this referendum. We will be sending electoral observers to the next elections, and ahead of that we will have a member of the European Parliament, and there we will be able to evaluate if conditions will guarantee transparent elections with no exclusions, with a fair playing ground during the pre-electoral period, and we will be able to evaluate how the elections will be run. It is quite clear that these elections are very important for the stability of Egypt. We need a democratically elected president, and we need a fair representation of political views in parliament. The European Union calls upon the Egyptian authorities to guarantee those who are accused to a fair and speedy trial with independent investigations and inquiries, and also of access to their families and to legal aid. We are very worried about the worsening economic situation on the ground and its negative implications for the vulnerable groups of the population. 1/2 of the Egyptian population today lives in abject poverty, and the most vulnerable group is children. So here the European Union will continue supporting the improvement of socio-economic conditions, make sure that we guarantee stability, investment, social justice, and of course the implementation of the main acts of economic reform. We need a stable democracy, a viable democracy, and that is a long and arduous path. To construct democracy, you need to work very hard, to be devoted, and to be able to compromise on all sides of the political spectrum, because your final objective is to set up the democratic, transparent institutions which will protect all citizens equally and all their fundamental rights. Egypt is a key country for all the big open problems in the Middle East and Northern Africa. It is of great importance for us, for Europe, for our strategy, for our external and foreign policy, for the southern neighborhood, and we need a stable and democratic Egypt on a path which will allow all Egyptian citizens to have a secure and positive future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first speaker is Mr. Salafranca.
Thank you, President, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. As the representative of the Presidency in office has just said, if we look in the rear-view mirror and we look what has happened over the last 3 years, it's been really impressive. The toppling of the Mubarak regime, the preparation of a new constitution that was put to a referendum, and the election of a new president in legislative elections, the fall of Morsi, and then a new constitution, a new referendum, and we're looking ahead to new legislative and presidential elections. Now, what we're seeing is a break with basic consensuses in Egypt, a high degree of polarization between the forces in the country, and a great deal of instability and violence. Also, as the representative of the Presidency in office said, there's been a serious worsening of economic and social conditions within the country. President, Egypt is an important and vital ally to the European Union. It's a country whose stability will prove vital for the stability of the region and the whole of the Middle East. Europe has to make a firm commitment to the stability of the region. It has to support the transition to democracy. Also, it needs to support the respect for basic freedoms and human rights, improving the security situation in the country. And we have followed the recent events carried out by the Muslim radicals in the Sinai Peninsula, and we do believe that most Egyptians want to focus on prosperity and stability in the country. We know that we have to support this process of transition to Egypt, which is extremely sensitive at the moment, and hopefully we will achieve the results that we would all like to see. Thank you, President.
Mrs. de Keyser.
Thank you, President. Mr. Venizelos, you spoke well, and you spoke indeed as a diplomat. I shall be perhaps less diplomatic in what I have to say, because I recollect that when under Morsi, the NGOs were saying, why are you remaining silent when you see things getting very difficult indeed? Now, we have to recognise that Egypt is a great country that is very dear to us, but we can't remain silent when we see what happens in the country today. Indeed, today there is unprecedented repression in Egypt. Unprecedented repression. Thousands and thousands of prisoners held, incarcerated. There is a constitution adopted that's better than the previous one, but the rate of turnout and support, you know, when people say 98% were in favour, I'm really more worried than if the figure had been lower. Where are the people who are opposing this? Where is the opposition in Egypt? You know, there are these fratricidal fissures which afflict Egypt's population. Now, calling about half of your population terrorists and putting each and every member of the Muslim Brotherhood in the dock is just sowing seeds of discord and dissent for the future. Certainly, yes, let us look at a roadmap. The Egyptians are our friends, but we can't go back to square one. Currently, we're seeing the army stepping into power with all the powers conferred under the new constitution, as if the revolution never happened. I would like to welcome the excellent work done by the External Action Service and those who will be representing us in Cairo on Saturday, and I'm sure you will be able to say in diplomatic terms what I have said a little more directly. Thank you.
Mrs. Skaka.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, I welcome you, but I really wish the High Representative, Ms. Ashton, would have been here herself. In Egypt, even when governments have changed, repression continues, and some argue it is the worst we have seen yet. Now, don't get me wrong, as a liberal Democrat, you will not hear me express a preference to go back to a political Islamic regime that was authoritarian. I also don't want to see a military regime restrict people's rights and opportunities under a different banner. The country must urgently make progress and move towards a better future. Now, for Europe, our principles should be clear, but we must also be realistic. We do not have a whole lot of leverage, and we've made mistakes in the past. So, at least, let us act according to our values and have the population of Egypt in mind as our main focus. That is in our mutual interest as well. Let's focus on the rights of minorities, whether they're Coptic or female. Today is International Day of Zero Tolerance for Genital Mutilation. Egypt is among the countries with the highest numbers. About 75% of girls and women are mutilated. The position of journalists. Yesterday, a Dutch journalist was forced to leave Egypt after being accused of membership of a terrorist network. And of course, many Egyptians have no such opportunity to return home to a free society with the help of diplomats. We must help ensure that they are not wrongfully imprisoned and that they can work and live in freedom. The question is really, what does the army have to fear from a free press and from activists like Ahmed Maher and the April 6 movement, from Alaa Abdel Fattah and from the many, many other human rights activists that are now imprisoned and that should never have been tried by military courts in the first place. I think of journalists of Al Jazeera, Mohammed Fadel Fahmy, Peter Greste and Baher Gorab. Civil society and a free press that can do their work must be an integral part of a democratic Egypt if we actually want to see progress and no repression anymore.
Thank you. Mrs. Lunacek.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. 3 years after the Arab Spring, on behalf of my political group, the Greens EFA, I need to express the deepest concern about the gravity of the current situation. Conservative estimates report that 1,400 Egyptians have died of political violence since the military coup in July. Put differently, that's 7 Egyptian citizens killed every day. The vast majority of these women and men have died under the brutal repression of security forces, simply for having sought to exercise their basic freedoms of assembly and of expression. The brutal crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood has been followed by a crackdown on civil society, human rights defenders and media. And don't get me wrong, the unacceptable terrorist attacks before the military coup and the violence by the radical branches of the Brotherhood are not and must not be considered an excuse for this repression. I'd like to refer to the situation of women especially. They continue to be particularly in a vulnerable situation in the current political and social transition. That's why I think the European Union should strongly defend women's rights, and the Egyptian interim authorities need to combat all forms of gender-based violence, including marital rape and sexual violence against women participating in protests and demonstrations. It is high time now for the European Union to say in a clear and unified manner that the current trend towards a consolidation of an authoritarian security regime in Egypt is unacceptable. In this regard, I find that the latest statement by Lady Ashton on the constitutional referendum, sorry to say so, smacks of the EU's past failed policy of the pre-Arab Spring era. Normalization, ladies and gentlemen, must not be the name of the game. We call on Lady Ashton and on the Council, Mr. Venizelos, to call a spade a spade. There is no democratic transition in Egypt, but there's a nasty security regime, and our policy needs to adapt to this hard fact. There can be no business as usual as long as this downward spiral continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bilan.
Thank you very much indeed, President. It's been 3 years now since the fall of Hosni Mubarak. The initial euphoria has soon been stifled by violence and economic stagnation. The situation is still far from stable, and there are continuous protests which sink the country in chaos. This is also influencing neighboring countries. We fear, because of the regular unjustified attacks of Islamists of Coptic minority. Dozens of churches were burned down. There were numerous casualties. I expect from the current government to undertake urgent actions to stop such outrageous acts of terror. Egypt remains a key economic partner of Europe in the Mediterranean. Therefore, Brussels must remain involved in solving problems in the country. It's particularly important that we support the Egyptian nation in the difficult process of change and transformation. I hope that the approaching presidential election will be a democratic one. I hope that the new constitution, although it is imperfect, will enable the country to function based on international political standards. I call upon the temporary authorities in Cairo to assure the free operation of international observation missions in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, President. Yes, the situation in Egypt is exceptional. They are undergoing a very serious situation, and that will continue as long as military forces are in charge of taking this charge of social change. Of course, a lot of this has been financed by the USA. I think it is a mistake. This leads to more repression, and it has been an error to outlaw the Islamic Brotherhood. We have nothing to do with them. But to intend to solve a problem by outlawing a group that represents about half of the population is a situation that needs to be corrected, and I think we need to make a call for elections in short order. We need to have guarantees of clean and fair elections and the proper participation.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Volosovic.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, 3 years ago, the Arab states all over the Gulf and in North Africa went through a turbulent process of change. We all hoped that the new solutions put in place would be the ones that would be welcomed by the Arab societies. Unfortunately, in Egypt, the new reality became even more complex. Nevertheless, the most recent months have brought about positive changes and new hopes. Details were discussed by my colleagues a moment ago. I do hope that the European Union and the European Parliament in particular will appreciate those changes and will prove this in our resolution. I do hope that in the forthcoming months we will support all the ongoing changes. Difficult but necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the group speakers have taken up a lot more time than they should have done. So we're running a bit late. So, could you please stick to your time? Mr. David, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. President Mansour announced presidential elections before the end of April, and the new parliament should be elected until July. After the referendum on the new constitution, the voice is given again to the people of Egypt. The institutions coming out of these elections are the ones we will have to work with. As European legislators, let's respect people's vote and not being patronizing as in the past. What we have witnessed were hurdles in a revolution, but everyone must participate in the new elections. Also, the EU must monitor in loco the upcoming electoral processes and react firmly in all cases of democratic breaches. Egypt cannot be a country where people are dying simply for fighting for their ideas or are put to jail because they are alleged terrorists or traitors. Numerous of these are foreign citizens. Some are journalists or diplomats. Yesterday's heroes are today's terrorists. Egypt needs all its citizens and movements to live in tolerance and mutual respect. This was not happening also in Morsi's regime. But no one is totally right, no one is totally wrong. The new European neighbourhood policy conditions our acts, and to respect the more and more principle, we have to say to our partners, show us you are embracing the fundamental values of democracy, freedom and solidarity, and we will gladly keep on supporting your efforts. If you don't do it, we will keep on supporting in your country and in your society those who are willing to. And I recall that the rule of law, judicial independence, tolerance and the sovereignty of the people are the core of democracy. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Rubig wants to ask you a question. Mr. Rubig, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. May I ask Mr. David his view on the situation in Tunisia, where, for example, there is a new constitution that's been positively commented on by ourselves. Do you believe that the Tunisian constitution could play a role in terms of standard setting for Egypt? Thank you.
Can you try and bring it back to Egypt, Mario?
Dear colleague Paul Rubig, I think that it is each country should have its own constitution, and no one should try to impose any model on anyone else. So I believe that each country should establish their own rules regarding, mainly when we are talking about the fundamental law of the country, and then I think it's very well done that they submit it to a referendum of their people. But no one should try to impose or have an example of. This is, I think that subsidiarity should apply in this one as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Gomez.
Egypt is moving backwards on the democracy process that Tahrir Square wanted to achieve. Lots of activists are being incarcerated. They are being prohibited from exercising their right to public gathering, and they're not allowed to express themselves as in accordance with international law. Now, the constitutional referendum process was doubtful at best. The low turnout and the debate was not free about the constitution. There were plenty of repressions regarding criticism of the constitution that was finally adopted. Now, in terms of fundamental rights and so on, what's in the constitution could be worse. However, what is in question here is how that is implemented in practice. And what we see on the ground is a situation that many people describe as significantly worse than under Mubarak in terms of human rights. Also, the fact that the army is in charge and taking control of civilian forces, control of the demonstrating forces, the fact that the armed groups and violent groups are on the increase. There's a radicalisation of the society in the country, and that's worse than ever. The situation is unstable and insecure. That's particularly seen in the Sinai region, which is totally out of control. We're seeing disappearances, killings, torture, similar to Eritrea and Somalia. Now, there will be no democracy in Egypt without an inclusive reconciliation process, and as such it's absolutely counterproductive to sideline and marginalise the Muslim Brotherhood. Otherwise it's simply creating a hot potato. By focusing on this more for more approach will do better, and it will be better to focus on association agreements and partnerships. We have to approach this from the right perspective. So what I can say is that in Egypt we have to do a great deal more to try to reflect the concerns that we're facing given the degradation of human rights situation in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Dalen.
President, I just came back from Egypt. I was in Cairo and elsewhere, and I've talked to many people in Armenia. There have been dozens of churches burned down by Muslim activists. In one of those, there were hundreds of Bibles that were burnt. I took one of them home. And the preacher said that if you go back to Europe, please ask for support from Europe to Egypt. The new Egypt has become very aware. They may not have the most perfect constitution, but they do have some fundamentals there. And so I think they are positioned for some positive improvement. So I think that we should support them economically and politically, because that is the message that Egypt wishes to hear.
Yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. 3 years after the revolution, the situation in Egypt is dire and society is split deeply. The recent violence, especially in the context of the referendum, terror attacks, the situation of the Coptic minority, are all sources of major concern for us. At the same time, the limit imposed on the freedom of expression, of association, or the freedom of religion further polarize this society. I was happy to hear that Stavros Lambrinidis will go to Egypt and discuss the issue of violence, the infringement of human rights, and I firmly believe that he will demand that the Egyptian authorities investigate all possible cases of abuse. However, we must not forget that there are also some positive signals coming out of Egypt. Despite the difficult circumstances in which the constitution was adopted, this document represents a major step forward, especially when it comes to the consecration of human rights and of fundamental freedoms. At the same time, of course, some have criticized the manner in which us Europeans reacted to the developments in Egypt. I believe that for now our strategy has been the right one. To be neutral but open is the right strategy under the aforementioned circumstances. I believe that in future we should continue to contribute to the realization of authentic political dialogue, because the split that I mentioned is an obstacle to dialogue. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you. Ms. Senegin, 1 minute.
Micro.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you, Madam President. The new constitution, supported clearly by the Egyptians, is to ensure a lay state, equal rights for men and women, but also autonomy to the army. This should lead to a new government being elected in a democratic election. Of key importance for solving the crisis in the country is open dialogue with the participation of all political forces. Egypt needs a policy that will be driven towards integration of its polarized society. Only such a policy will allow it to be stable politically, to develop economically, and to be safe and secure in the region. There are catastrophic reports on riots, fights, and casualties. There's been this wave of violence which shows that the situation deteriorates and a compromise is difficult to be found. Therefore, we call upon all sides to refrain from violence, and we call upon the authorities to ensure security of all citizens despite of their opinions or political affiliation. Also, all cases of murder must be properly investigated, in particular in the case of peaceful demonstrations. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Thank you. Mr. Pöttering, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Egypt is one of the most important Islamic and Arab countries, and I think the constitution can be the basis of an appropriate development, but there are no guarantees. We have to see reconciliation between the various groups in society. We have to have a clear no to any forms of violence, and I think that the army could play a role in achieving reconciliation between the different parts of the population. It's important that the constitution recognize that everyone is equal and equally deserving of respect. And indeed that applies to the Muslims, many of whom are entirely peaceful in their actions, the Coptic Christians, and the Jewish population as well, for example. And certain judgments have been handed down against non-governmental organizations, such as the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where 2 assistants of that organization were sentenced to 5 and 3 years in jail, and that has to be subject to review. And I very much hope that those wonderful people who came down into Tahrir Square in February 2011, they want to live in a community of values such as we do, with freedom and rule of law. I hope that the aspirations of those young people will come good in Egypt. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Arlacchi.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arlacchi, 1 minute.
President, it's time for the EU to stop taking sides and position at any political turn of the Egyptian transition. I believe that Europe should focus its attention on the quality of institution building. Therefore, our efforts should be all aimed at strengthening the rule of law and bolstered institutions and economic reform. To do so, I value of primary importance a measure such as asset recovery. The restitution of frozen assets is, over and above its economic significance, a strong message against the impunity for corruption and money laundering enjoyed so far by unscrupulous political leaders in Egypt and elsewhere. I would like to reiterate that the only way to build a sustainable democracy in Egypt is the path of national reconciliation and an inclusive political process. For that reason, I think that any ban, exclusion or repression against the political force of actors in Egypt repeats past mistakes and only leads to an increased radicalism.
Thank you. Mr. Myanmar, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Egypt is an important country in our Mediterranean neighborhood, and it has played a very important role in the Arab world. What has happened here is not indifferent to the region. I think that the message that Egypt should get from the EP is the need for dialogue and trying to search for a consensus between the Egyptian authorities and the social forces in the country. It's a very complicated situation, and we need to have deep thinking and compromise, and this is something that was ignored by the Islamic Brotherhood and Morsi. And now we cannot see Egypt fall into the same trap as its predecessors. I think we need to have agreements in order to have reconciliation, democracy and peace. This is stability that we want for Egypt. They need to have democratic cohabitation and respect for human rights. We should not have confrontation as we had in Algeria in the 90s. The various players have tried to come up with a cohabitation agreement, and this could be a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gritz, 1 minute.
Grazie, signora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. In this House, Egypt was first followed by enthusiasm coming out of the Arab Revolution, then a degree of disappointment as we saw that the government has not met our expectations, then concern about the coup, and then we are now anxious to make sure that the new steps related to the new constitution will serve the purpose of democratization of Egypt. What is really important and noteworthy is that the National Egyptian Council for Human Rights has been established, so Egypt is in the right track to protect human rights. I think that we should lend support to the changes to the economy and to the teething democracy, to the civil society, and we do have instruments in our hands to do so. Also, we would like to make sure that minorities are not repressed in Egypt, especially the minorities which are related to other religions professed or national background. I think that we can call on the Egyptian authorities to put in place such new solutions accompanying the new constitutions that will guarantee free operation of international society and NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the catch the eye, and colleague Stasny first, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I strongly support the resolution regarding Egypt, which condemns all the acts of violence, terrorism and incitement being committed to the citizens of Egypt. We should urge all the military and political actors to avoid any provocations or unjust actions which can cause the ongoing volatile situation to deteriorate. The authorities should ensure that there is security and stability throughout the country, especially in the Sinai area. I also would like to stress the importance of assuring the fundamental democratic rights every Egyptian citizen deserves and end any kind of oppression being committed towards them. The international community must also contribute to ensure that stability and democracy once again governs Egypt. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now colleague Korkola.
Thank you very much, President. I've been to Egypt on many occasions over the past few years, and I have met many stakeholders, council members, political members, feminists, NGOs, people from the Islamic Brotherhood. And last time I was there, I heard that the EU is too formulaic and it doesn't really acknowledge the tyranny that is wrought upon people. They only look at election results. The Islamic Brotherhood stopped being democratic just after it got its power, so it's an issue of control. And another feedback that I got is, please support Egypt, support the Constitution, support the fact that we want to go on the road to democracy, and that is why we need to cooperate with the Egyptians now.
Grazie.
Thank you. Colleague Zaleski.
Signora Presidente, cari colleghi.
Thank you. President, colleagues.
2 points. One is a general message that goes from this House to Egyptians who fight for democracy, who fight for rule of law. And this is magnificent. It should be so. We should stress it, and I think this is what we do. But I would like also to put in this message something very concrete, how we can help those who fight for these values. One of the instruments is what we can offer: education. I remember the periods before we entered the European Union that many more Egyptian students took part or profited from our education offered in Western countries, including also Poland. What about now? Can we do some more for those who fight for those values that we share with them? And in this way, we would transmit something more concrete from this place to Egypt. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you. Mr. Rubik, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think we need to put some thought into what concrete measures we can put in place over the next few weeks and months. One consideration is, what programme can the European Union offer for our Egyptian friends in terms of education, but many other sectors? How can we set up an active programme to work intensively with civil society? I think that's a key challenge. Also, strengthening trade relationships with small and medium-sized companies, particularly. Also, trying to work with journalists and promote additional training for those groups. The separation of powers in Egypt can be a key factor. We need to make that extremely clear if we're to get good election results. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you. Colleague Schmidt, please.
Talman, fru kommissionär och herr minister, några ord om de fasansfullheter som...
Thank you very much. Just a few words are on some of the terrible things that are happening in the Sinai. Thousands of refugees from Eritrea, and they are taken as hostage. They are exploited, tortured. Their organs have been stolen. They have been murdered. What can the EU do for these defenseless people? We need to demand that Egypt do something as well. The families that live in Europe, well, if they, don't pay up 50,000 euros, then those family members in Egypt get dragged to the desert and slain. There is a legal case now where there are 2 people who have been accused of extortion and kidnapping of a Swedish woman, but Europol isn't doing anything about it.
Grazie.
Thank you. And colleague Murphy, please.
Thank you, President. 3 years after the fall of Mubarak, the Egyptian government incredibly tries to cling to the mask of saviours of the revolution. For millions of activists who actually made that revolution, they see its true face, the face of authoritarianism, the old elites and the forces of reaction. The low turnout for the referendum illustrates that point. The crackdown on protesters has been vicious. The attack on democratic rights has been incredibly widespread, including the jailing of 20 Al Jazeera journalists for supposedly aiding terrorist groups. Its repression has been wielded against workers, against socialist activists, with many trade unionists being jailed and intimidated. Life for working people is getting harder, inflation at over 11%, unemployment at over 13%. The lesson from the past 3 years for working people is clear. They can only rely on their own forces to break the deadlock of authoritarianism, repression and social catastrophe. They need to build their own organisations, independent trade unions, a mass party of working people, to redevelop the revolutionary movement and fight for a government of workers and poor people. Thanks.
Grazie.
Thank you. That concludes the Catch the Eye moment, and Minister Venizelos, you have the floor.
Thank you. I've listened to the statements of the honourable members of the European Parliament, and I think they have covered the whole spectrum of views that we have in the European Union on the issue of Egypt. The position, the official or institutional position of the European Union, as expressed by Baroness Ashton with the support of the Foreign Affairs Council, is a principled, clear, careful position, and at the same time it tries to be effective. It tries to maintain the ability to apply pressure in practical matters in order to bring to a close this very difficult transitional period towards the rule of law and democracy. The situation is always critical and very vulnerable. It's fragile. It's not possible to keep people in prison because of their political views, or have journalists imprisoned. We are concerned, and we always explore our concern for this imprisonment of political journalists. You can't restrict the freedom to peacefully demonstrate, to express your views, and I agree with you. Women should be protected. I did take a particular note of what you said about the Sinai Peninsula and the situation there. And I have to say that because I'm the Greek Foreign Minister, this is an area that's of particular interest of us, because there is a historical Byzantine monastery there, the monastery of St. Catherine, which is a treasure of international cultural heritage. Obviously, many steps have been made. We have the new improved constitution which was ratified, which includes the respect of fundamental rights, and this will allow Egypt to make a new start. That's what we wish for. That's what we are pushing for. Egypt must not miss this very important opportunity. We should break the cycle of violence, and we should stop acting in a way which leads to violence. So no provocation, no hate rhetoric, no political expressions that stigmatize without making a distinction, political groups calling them terrorists. We should make a conscious and systematic effort to allow all political forces to participate in this political process, which will allow them to take part in a more friendly, conclusive, peaceful process. Otherwise, we won't achieve our targets. No political force can govern Egypt on its own, using its own vision for society. You need pluralism. You need to synthesize different kinds of views. You need to coexist, and polarization makes things dangerous, and the implications are very negative on the economy. I have also visited fairly recently the city of Cairo and have discussed these issues not just with my fellow Egyptian foreign minister, but also with the Prime Minister of Egypt, and we have paid particular attention to economic issues. For over a year, the European Union, and in particular Baroness Ashton and the Special Representatives Mr. Lone and Mr. Lambrinidis, who will be visiting Cairo in the next few days, have been taking part in efforts to make sure that all political forces can participate in an inclusive process to bring a solution to this issue. But if you have constant violence, terrorist attacks, loss of life, obviously the environment is difficult and it's very hard to take the necessary steps. So the purpose of Baroness Ashton, who I have the honour to represent here, is to try, with the support of the EP and the European Council, to keep open the channels of dialogue with all political forces in Egypt in order to support all necessary initiatives which will lead to democracy, the rule of law and coexistence. Reconciliation, and this will bring benefits to the stability of Egypt. You have given us examples of other countries in the Arab world and also in the broader area of Northern Africa. It is true that traditionally and historically Egypt, because of its size, is not used to copying other models. It normally plays the role of a model for developments in the broader region. We should take this into account because we need to understand, and we always, I think, comprehend at the institution of the European Union, the special gravity and weight of the situation in Egypt, you know, economically, militarily. So I think that we've had an honest discussion here. We've represented all the views held by European society, and I think it was very useful for the steps that we need to take ahead of us at Council. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Minister. I have received 7 motions for resolution, the inclusion of debate. The vote will take place tomorrow at noon. On the agenda, we now have declaration of the Council and Commission concerning the EU-Russia summit. And I shall give the floor straight away to Minister Venizelos, speaking for Council.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament. Although this presidency of the Council does not take part in the summit meetings between the European Union and Russia or other third states, we are very happy to be here to inform you about what happened at the EU-Russia summit last week. This was a meeting that, at a very difficult moment in time, obviously because of the crisis in Ukraine, offered us the opportunity to openly discuss fundamental aspects of the relationship between Russia and Europe. We need to send a strong message that these developments need to be dealt with in a way which will allow our partnership agreement to find its way forward. Why? Because we have different approaches on what the Eastern Partnership should be like, on the Ukraine, and also on commercial issues, which are points of friction, points which could easily, I feel, be settled. The commitments have been undertaken under the auspices of the WTO, and also commitments on fundamental rights and human rights need to be complied with. And it was very interesting to hold that type of dialogue with Minister Lavrov, and also the most recent discussion we had amongst ourselves, the foreign ministers of member states, on how we see our relations with Russia developing. At that summit we held open and sincere dialogue on these issues, and we'd like to welcome the intention of the Russian Federation to participate in this. We know that Russia understands what the challenges are to our relationship, and they also understand that they have a very strong interest in keeping up cooperation with the European Union on the most constructive possible level. I think Commissioner Füle, who has made a lot of effort, very hard effort, will have more to tell you and will be able to explain to you what the conclusions of these talks were.